All right, 5 after the hour. So we are going to get started, and I think we'll have a few more people join us in the audience as we go. Can you all hear me okay without the mic? Great. Use my professor voice. So good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Romy Webb. I am an assistant professor at the Columbia Climate School and the deputy director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law here at Columbia Law School. The Sabin Center is an academic think tank working to develop and advance innovative legal tools to combat the climate crisis and to advance climate justice. And we're really pleased to be co-hosting tonight's panel along with energy innovation. So our topic for tonight is, of course, electricity system decarbonization, where we stand and the challenges ahead. And it's obviously a timely one. As many of you will remember, just last week, New York City and the surrounding areas were shrouded in a thick cloud of smoke from the wildfires in Canada, which continue to burn even today. Climate change is, of course, making those sorts of extreme events more frequent and causing them to be more severe. We know that to mitigate climate change, we need to rapidly and dramatically reduce our carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. And the way to do that is by decarbonizing energy and other systems. We're starting to make progress on that, both here in the United States and in other countries around the world, but we still have a lot of work to do. So I just want to highlight a couple of good news items, and then we'll maybe talk about some bad. Here in the United States, renewables are the fastest growing energy source, up over 90% since 2000. A report issued by the US Energy Information Administration in January predicted that renewables would exceed a quarter of the country's electricity generation for the first time next year. And other countries have already passed that threshold. We have Jack here from Australia, where I think in 2021, renewables were about 29% of total electricity generation. Last year in the UK, 40% of electricity was generated. So we've seen these increases in recent years that are really encouraging, but obviously we still have a long way to go. And the sort of scale of the transformation that's needed and the time that we need to do it in presents some serious challenges. Those of you who work in the energy space will, I'm sure, often hear about the challenges associated with integrating variable renewables into the grid. But even before we get to that point, we're going to need to build a lot of new facilities, which can itself be really difficult. So a couple of weeks ago, the Sabin Center published a report on opposition to renewable energy facilities in the United States. My colleague Matthew Eisenson is the lead author of that report. In it, he identifies 228 local laws, ordinances, and policies that have been enacted in 35 states to restrict renewable energy projects. This sort of local opposition presents a serious obstacle to meeting state, federal, and ultimately global climate goals. So we're going to, I'm sure, talk more about this and other challenges around decarbonizing the electricity system here tonight. And so I'm going to hand over to our moderator, Mike O'Boyle. Mike is a senior director at Energy Innovation. He leads Energy Innovation's electricity program, which is focused on designing and assessing the impact of policies to affordably and reliably decarbonize the electricity grid. So he is the perfect person to lead our discussion tonight.
All right. I'm just going to pull this out. Should we just pass it among ourselves? Hi, everyone. Thank you, Romany, for the introduction. And thank you to Columbia Law School and the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law for hosting this event. So I just wanted to maybe offer a couple more facts that can help us scope our conversation about the electricity system and its role in decarbonizing the global economy. So today, the electricity system represents about 30% of global emissions and is responsible for providing about 20% of final energy consumption globally. According to the International Energy Agency's net zero analysis, we have to go faster on the electricity system decarbonization. It's more affordable. We have more technologies available today at scale to decarbonize the electricity sector than many other sectors. And then grow the electricity sector significantly handling electrification of vehicles, buildings, and industry. In the United States, some of the deep decarbonization studies that have been done show that electricity load needs to grow between 3 and 4 times to reach net zero. And electricity will have to reach, according to IEA, about 50% of total final energy consumption by 2050. So growing from 20% to 50%. So the incredible wealth of knowledge that we have up here represents energy regulators. They're managing the energy transition. Sort of everywhere you look, there are energy companies that are natural monopolies that will be controlling the investments in the grid, controlling investments in new infrastructure that these folks are managing. And many of you, or all of you, come from jurisdictions that are leading in one way or another on the energy transition. So I'm really excited to hear from each of you and have this discussion, which really will be kind of a discussion-based panel. We have almost an hour and a half and getting a little feedback, sorry. So let me introduce our 5 panelists. So in the order to my left, first we have Rory Christian, the chair and CEO of the New York Public Service Commission. Second, we have Jack Schmidtke, general counsel at the Australian Energy Market Commission. And then Alice Reynolds, president of the California Utilities Commission. And then Jim Gannon, the chair of the Ireland Commission for Regulation of Utilities. And finally, Stephanie Eppner, global director or senior director of global initiatives at the Climate Imperative Foundation, and a former special advisor and acting senior director for climate and energy at the US National Security Council. Let me just start off the discussion. Each of you maybe give about a few minutes to help us answer the prompt of this discussion, which is electricity system decarbonization, where we stand and the challenges ahead. So where does your commission, or in Stephanie's case, perhaps a survey of sort of the global state of affairs, stand on electricity decarbonization? How is it going now? And what is the biggest challenge you face right now in decarbonizing the electricity system?
Hi, Rory Christian, chair of the New York State Public Service Commission. We see decarbonization as core to achieving the state's goals, which have been enshrined in the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which sets a target of 70% renewable energy by 2030 and the goal of an emissions-free electricity sector by 2040. Now, in terms of the greatest challenge, where do I start? There is no single greatest challenge. It's a very challenging process throughout, in part because I think when most people think about decarbonization, they simply think about windmills and solar. How's this better? Thanks. They think about thank you. They think about windmills and solar farms, but there's much more to it than that. We need to build out a transmission and distribution backbone unlike anything we've ever had before. We need to ensure that that backbone is set up in such a way where we can take advantage of what will be a variety of resources operating at different periods of time and in different ways. And again, the grid historically has not been set up to work that way. We'll need to integrate a variety of new technologies, batteries, for one, and we have programs with that in mind. Offshore wind, another, we also have a program with that in mind. But we'll also need to look at things from the customer's side, because much of what we're doing presumes we're changing the grid. But I think what's rarely talked about, or at least what I rarely hear about, is how we as individuals are going to change our relationships with the very energy that is driving the crisis that's ahead of us. Many of you have likely heard of programs that will remotely control your air conditioner, raising the temperature in periods where it's hot. That's a taste of the kind of future that we envision here in New York, where we'll be able to remotely manage these high energy users in a way that's beneficial to the well-being of the grid, and thus potentially lower our need for greater levels of renewable energy over time. So all of this is a huge challenge. All of this requires a review of everything from privacy laws to regulations on how utilities can act and what they can invest in. And all of that is a challenge. So, yeah.
Jack Schmidtke from the Australian Energy Market Commission. Maybe it's worth just giving some context to Australia as well. So I work for the rule maker of the national electricity market, and that's primarily on the east coast of Australia. It's about 80% of electricity consumption is in the national electricity market. It's a very big grid. It's about 40,000 kilometres or so. It's completely interconnected all the way down to Tasmania, which is an island off the mainland. So there's a big interconnector there under the water. Because it's such a large grid and it's quite stringy in its structure, there are some complexities to transforming it, bringing in more renewables into the system. There's been some progress on the renewables front. We are world leaders in terms of solar PV on residential homes. We have about 30% of all homes have solar on the roofs, which, it's a great development. But there are a number of challenges as well, which I'll get to in a minute. Some of the other, I guess, good elements of progress are some states have high rates of renewables. So South Australia, for instance, has about 73% of solar wind. And on some days, it's 100% of demand is actually met through renewables, which is quite a good achievement. Tasmania as well, which, as I said, is the sort of southern island, which is a state just off the mainland. It's 100% renewables, so it's powered purely by hydro plant. We have legislated targets now too, which is a great outcome. So net zero by 2050 and about 83% reduction on 2015 levels by 2030, which is also a good target in terms of emissions reduction. And we have a federal government recently who's committed to about $20 billion in what's called the rewiring of the nation, which will look to invest in transmission and other renewables as well. But in terms of challenges, there's quite a number of them. Obviously, one of them is energy prices, which I'm sure other various jurisdictions have represented here are sort of grappling with that at the moment with high commodity prices. That's flowed through to high domestic energy prices. So that's something to grapple with. The rate of exiting coal, I mean, that's good for emissions reduction, but what it means is there needs to be more firm capacity coming into the market very quickly. In order to do that, there needs to be significant transmission build. So Australia would probably need about 10,000 kilometres of new transmission in order to build the renewables to replace that exiting coal. Currently, on current estimates, it's looking like 60% of coal plants will be gone by 2030. So it just gives a sense of the scale of the build that's necessary in order to meet that exiting firm capacity. Extreme weather events in Australia, it's obviously been a big thing in the last couple of years. We had catastrophic bushfires in 2020. Similar to New York, we had, quite dense smoke around capital cities, which has posed issues from an energy system as well. So renewables, particularly solar, don't perform as well. Obviously, if there's smoke in the air, distribution and transmission lines become vulnerable due to bushfires. So that presents quite a lot of issues for a stable and resilient system. Another area is what we call social license. So ensuring that communities, find that the new transmission builds are acceptable. We have had a number of challenges to large infrastructure projects, so that has slowed down the pace of change. And it's something that we have to grapple with. But as an organisation, we're very committed to meeting those emissions targets. And actually, recently, the federal and state governments, who both actually have to agree to any changes in the law that give us our functions, have agreed to including an emissions objective in our actual objective. So it's legislated, so we have to consider it when we make our decisions, which is quite a big decision, quite a big change for us as an organisation, and we're looking to embrace that. But in terms of addressing those areas, those challenges, And we'll get to this as we progress the questions. But I think for us, we sort of categorize them into three things. So resilience, you have to build the resilience of the system. Transformation, we have to accommodate transmission reform to get the transmission out there to connect to renewables, and then innovation as well. So some of what Rory was talking about in terms of different ways of managing your energy, controlled load, distributed energy resources, ensuring that particularly at a distribution level, the system can cope with that. It wasn't built to have a large amount of exports, particularly at the residential level. So, but that's key to a successful system going forward. So how do we do that? What technologies are needed to do that is sort of a focus of our organisation as well. So thanks.
Thank you. Alice Reynolds from the California Public Utilities Commission. I'll start by saying that I'm just really pleased to be on this panel with my colleagues. Sometimes in California, when you're working on individual dockets and you're kind of head down facing challenges, you forget that there are so many other people who are facing the same challenges we are. Already, I've heard a lot of the same issues raised that we're thinking about in California. So really looking forward to the discussion. So a little bit about the California Public Utilities Commission. We regulate the privately owned utilities in California. So not just energy, but also water, communications, rail, and so energy, both electric and gas, and transportation. And so for energy, the energy sector, that's about 75% of the retail sales in California. And just to give you some context also about California by megawatt hours is about half of the energy in the Western interconnection. 40 million people, we have a little bit of everything. We have very rural, rugged areas, and we have large cities. We have deserts, and we have redwood forests. And so, I think just starting off with part of the challenge is the diversity that we're dealing with in making this transition to clean energy statewide. We started with our renewable portfolio standard about 20 years ago, so we have made a lot of progress. We are no longer reliant on coal, essentially. And so for us, the challenge is natural gas and transitioning away from reliance on natural gas, which we still very much need for reliability. We've reached about 37% renewables, and we define renewables for our renewable portfolio standard to exclude large hydro and nuclear. And so we also count the carbon-free power in our system, and that takes us up to about 59%. So we've made a lot of progress, but the challenges ahead are incredibly significant. We've had also a fairly flat load in California for about the past 40 years. So stable system, flat load. We've done a lot of energy efficiency, including starting in the 70s with updating buildings. And so we've able to, although our population has grown, fourth largest economy in the world now, we've managed to keep load pretty flat. That's going to be changing in the future. And so we're really rushing to be ready with the capacity that we need with the distribution and transmission system to support that capacity, and really working on all of the different levers to try to manage what we see in the future. What's changing, of course, is the not only a continued population growth and increased air conditioning, increased extreme heat waves, but also electrification of our transportation and building sector. We have about 90% gas fueled buildings in California. And so that is a significant challenge when you think about retrofitting that existing building stock. And then we have a lot of cars. We have made a lot of progress in the transportation sector. We've in the last year hit about just over 20% electric vehicle sales, new vehicles. And so that was a big milestone for us, and obviously a significant increase in the past few years. We're trying to make sure the infrastructure is ready to meet that increase. So although we've had great adoption levels, we're still struggling to keep pace. And then also focusing our investments and our state investments and federal, to the extent that we can, on medium and heavy duty infrastructure, transportation. And that, of course, helps us with significant air quality problems, which we also have, especially in LA and the Central Valley. So while there's great promise there, there's also significant challenges. I want to raise, I guess, just one point that hasn't been touched on that I'm sure all of my colleagues are grappling with as well, is affordability and thinking about rates, electricity rates as being so important for the fuel of the future. And so their electricity rates are both the thing that can fund a lot of these investments that we're making, but also what customers bear in terms of switching from fossil fuels. So choices between, we want electricity to compete with petroleum for gasoline cars. We want electricity to compete with natural gas for fueling your heat pumps, your air conditioning, your home heating, your water heating. And then just the cost of living that's hitting our consumers in California. So while we're trying to go as fast as possible, we're also looking at cost-effective solutions, new technologies that can scale and scale quickly, and those solutions that really help us keep electricity prices down. Of course, there's light at the end of the tunnel as you start adding more megawatts onto the system. You can push prices down, but we're really trying to get over the hump where we've made a lot of investments recently that are hitting ratepayers. I'll add one final thing, and that is dealing with the impacts of climate change. And so I don't know, maybe misery loves company, but we have definitely experienced what New York has seen over the past few days in California in the past, as wildfires, catastrophic wildfires have grown in intensity over recent years. And the smoke has blown into urban areas and has been felt throughout the state. So we've made a lot of investments in our utility infrastructure because some of the fires that we've experienced were caused by utility infrastructure, so ignitions, not all of them, but some of them. So we've done a lot of work on that. Those investments are starting to hit rates. We're experiencing extreme heat, which I mentioned, that can stress our grid in the summertime. So working on new increasing peaks, but really those kind of tail peaks, so they don't hit every day. They hit at various times throughout the summer. We don't know when they're coming, and they're lasting longer and higher temperatures than we've ever seen before. So many challenges. I'll stop there.
But lots of hope, Alice, I think at the same time. So Jim Gannon, I'm the chairperson at the Commission for Regulation of Utilities. Not dissimilar to Alice in terms of scope, but in terms of scale, we are quite a bit smaller. So we also have electricity, gas, water, and gas and electricity safety, in fact, also upstream and down into the homes and businesses in the country. And there's been a huge focus on decarbonisation of electricity in particular in Ireland over the past number of years. So in 2021, similarly, we were about 40% renewable electricity, the rest provided by a combination of gas, coal and oil. The coal and oil facilities are closing over the next 18 months. By 2030, we're targeted to be 80% renewable energy focused or renewable energy supplied in the electricity sector. A challenge for us, however, is that we are hugely interconnected to our neighbouring European mainland or to the UK. So for us, a significant amount of the investment will in fact be in system resilience and system stability. So ancillary services, in particular, making sure there's inertia, voltage. We now need to start thinking about harmonics when you get up to that level of renewable electricity generation as well. And where in the past we used to have those services just because big pieces of metal were spinning and were connected to the grid, we now need to replace those. And for us, one of the key challenges is reducing that level of minimum generation that was thermally generated with other providers, such as synchronous condensers, another piece of spinning metal, but something supplied by something a little more green when it starts spinning. So how do you pay for that service? How do you make the investment case, particularly in a transition? Separately, I think we're also entering one of the more expensive parts of the transition, because as we move into that more decarbonized future, but don't really have that long-term energy storage to deal with a 2-week bridge or a 2-week Dunkelflaute, which would be 2 weeks without solar, 2 weeks without wind. We don't quite have that yet. So for us, gas, unfortunately, will likely be a transition fuel for us. So how do we get someone to build large gas facilities that will last 25 years, where the marginal cost of electricity could be close to zero post 2030 and 2035? And you need to consider then capacity mechanisms. And the cost of all of that. And for us, we're in a similar position to Rory, where we have some of the backbones in place, but particularly to allow our offshore resource onshore to demand, and also a way to market in other jurisdictions, it's going to require a lot of infrastructural investment. So that burden will be placed on the economy, either through the exchequer or through to us and do us through the network charges that find their ways onto the bill. And we'll attract as much private investment into the fray as we can, but there will be an additional cost to consumers. So I think that two key points to the consumer that are going to be really challenging are the cost of living crisis and the fact that where we want to get to will result in lower electricity prices, but we're entering an investment phase, which implies quite a bit of cost. So having people understand that the transition will not be costless, even though it will bring us to a better place. And then that consumer in the home, because no matter how we model it, we will not hit net zero without significant demand response. And that's at large scale industry and in the home. And what's unclear to us is that we're a couple of tables of nerds up here who might have an app and we say, I will respond to that price and I will turn on my A, B, and C. The rest of humanity isn't quite like that. So it may be like similar models where someone will knock on your front door and say, I already provide you with your broadband and your telephony and your TV channels. I'll do your energy too. You have a smart meter in place. I'll deal with all the signals. And some call me an aggregator, but I'll just be your block utility provider. But the thing then is complex for utility regulators to make sure that everyone's protected in that sort of world. But I think that like the role of behavioral economics in effective regulation through a transition will become actually far more important than it ever has been. And it's something we're trying to deploy even now. That's about it for now.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Mike, for inviting me to be part of this panel. It has been just interesting to hear all of you speak, particularly because my experience is just so different. And I've looked at these challenges from a very different perch. Mike mentioned I just left the Biden administration recently. I was at the White House serving on the National Security Council, where I oversaw the directorate that's responsible for coordinating the administration's policy on international climate and energy engagement. So it's a lot of diplomacy. I'm not looking at this at a local level or a city level or a state or country level. Really, it's a lot of what can we use diplomacy to get our countries to be working together toward, and how can we be taking advantage of some of the various political pressures that we're all facing and really driving towards a future that benefits all of us. And I first came into the administration in 2021. I had served in the Obama administration, took a little break for 4 years, and then came back in. And the thing that I saw that was just a sort of a sea change in the way that people at the leader level, at the highest levels of government that are looking at all of our foreign policy and national security issues are starting to think about climate and energy. And in some countries, it's been that way for a little while, and in some, it's taken us a little bit longer to get there. But I think the conversation among world leaders has really evolved to a place where the climate crisis is fully sort of understood, and the policy decisions that will need to take us there are also understood. But about a year and a half ago, a lot changed in the international conversation when Russia invaded Ukraine, and the energy and electricity conversation shifted in a number of ways. And conversations about what a responsible energy transition looks like, what energy security really means, what constitutes clean energy. All of these conversations got a little bit more challenging in some ways. And so before we get down to a level of implementation, I saw some things that I think we've all seen that are a little bit concerning in the momentum sense, that we'd like to see going in a different direction. I think perhaps in addition to all of the technical challenges that my fellow panelists have detailed, among the biggest challenges is still going to be political will. It's still going to be, how can we make sure that the added energy crisis that we're facing, that the conflicting messages that policymakers are getting and that constituents are expressing, that we're still able to deliver the message that energy security, responsible energy transition, that these things are not inconsistent
concepts, that they're in fact very consistent, and that we should be going sort of full speed ahead towards the energy transition, towards electrifying industries, and towards bringing more renewables online and changing the way we power our economies. I think the political will is, it's not going any, that challenge is not getting any easier. It looked maybe that it would be, it's not going to get any easier anytime soon. And so I think that's a big hurdle that we're all going to face at sort of every level of government too.
Yeah, thank you. A common thread that I heard each of you touch on, I think political will especially becomes relevant when it comes to where to put all the stuff, all the renewable generation, the infrastructure, the distribution upgrades, the transmission lines. And as we electrify, that need is only going to grow. And I think there's always the things that are right ahead of us, but then there's, if we're going to double or triple demand, and you all don't have control, right, of the policies that drive emissions reductions necessarily, but you end up having to sort of implement them. I guess my question for comment for each of you is, what is your role, and how do you take on the challenge of addressing like people's concerns about where infrastructure is sited, and then how do you work with utilities to get those things built so that you can meet the renewable energy goals or other climate objectives that you face? How is that showing up for you? I know it's not a simple challenge, but it's remarkable how it shows up across jurisdictions. That we have to build a lot of these things, and generally people don't like seeing new infrastructure projects happen near them. It's challenging. And you can answer, anyone who wants to go first. We don't have to always go down the line. Jim.
I'm happy to go first. So in my previous roles, I was a consulting engineer delivering infrastructure for some of these companies that I now regulate. And then for a period of time, I was chief executive of our Sustainable Energy Authority, which was a messaging and incentivization organization, exchequer funded to deliver change through grants, but also change through understanding of infrastructure and spatial planning. And I think some of the challenges in Ireland are coming across jurisdictions, has been some of the findings of studies that we did in that organization, where people don't have a link anymore to infrastructure. So the road that I drive on, or the water that I get from my tap, or not just the electricity I use, but the confidence that when I flick the switch, the light will come on, which is something slightly different. We don't feel that value until something goes wrong with it, or more of it is needed and we perceive it as an imposition. So we need political leadership allied to media to help people to understand the ongoing value that infrastructure provides them with, more generally than just renewables and wires. I think something that's going to come up in Ireland significantly, and I think Rory alluded to it, Alice, given the difference between, as you described, sort of a rural plus peri-urban plus urban environment, there's a huge difference in California between the different locations you have, is equity across that. So in Ireland, about 80 or 90% of our resources are on the western side of the country, in terms of wind in particular. That's the predominance of our resource. All of our demand is in the east and the southeast. So it all has to come from one place where there's very low demand across that area of low demand. So the infrastructural burden spatially will not reflect where the demand is, where the requirement is. And that's something that we can already see bubbling. And then the other piece is around political leadership, where when they talk about national policy, apologies, being a pejorative term for politicians, they're very much for decarbonization, but locally, the messaging can often be quite different. So it's hard to break from that electoral cycle, break from that local piece. But we're finding politicians that are braver in doing that. So not very many solutions there, but more a sympathetic ear. But I do think that on the ground, we are seeing that different surveys, representative sample sizes are showing that a predominance of people now welcome renewable energy infrastructure, but they're forgetting that it has to get from that point of generation to the point of demand. And that's sort of the next stage or the next domino we hope would form.
Oh, okay. Thanks. I just wanted to follow you, Jim, because I think you made so many great points. And in particular, one of your points on behavioral economics. And I think you're right, this is going to play a big role. So if we have young people in the audience or listening in and they're looking for a field to study, and that you think there's going to be a lot of work in behavioral economics and economics in general. And it goes to this point of, we're not talking about building a coal plant here, right? We're talking about projects that we need to get to a better place to improve our air quality. So we're not talking about development, industrialization in a way that is going to lead to negative impacts in terms of health and air quality. We're trying to get away from those, but yet we're going to retain our industrialized society. So we're moving from one type of industrialized society to another, hopefully with a clean infrastructure. It's very, very difficult, but it's also it's a different mindset when we think about encouraging projects and encouraging development. And just to give you a few examples, I feel like I am going from the hard challenges to the really, optimistic, inspirational in some of my remarks here. But I'll start with the good news. In California, in the past 3 years, we went from about 250 megawatts of battery storage on our system to 5,000 megawatts. So over 200 times increase. And so these are batteries, they're good sized batteries. They can work with, they have come through for us on extreme events, and you can see them working when you look at how the system is. They charge up during the middle of the day and they just discharge just when we need them, when our solar is going offline. You can put them at an existing power plant. You can, they can be standalone. You can put them at a solar project. And so we're not talking about a huge new development. But there's supply chain issues, there's cost. There are land use, some permitting issues that we have to deal with. But then we have offshore wind, which we are also very serious about in California, and some similarities, I think, to our European counterparts. But the best wind off the coast of California, which is actually, I'm told, very, very strong, excellent wind that complements our intermittent renewables, is not located near our load centers. And so we will need to build in the Central Coast and the North Coast, and then have a way to store, to transmit. And we are studying the transmission system that's needed to get there. We're hoping, and it is looking like, given the strength of the resource, that it will turn out to be cost effective for our system and really will provide a great help with the extensive amount of new energy that we need to bring online. I don't know if any of you saw an article by Bill McKibben in The Nation recently that talked about, I think it was called Why We Must Build or something, and it talked about this kind of mentality of like oppose, that there has always been like any kind of project, we need to oppose it. And it was about the shift and, that we need to, at this point, think about these projects differently, which is really where I started, that this is what we need for climate change. It's not a new gas pipeline. It's not a new coal plant, but these are the projects that we need to get to our future.
Keep going, sorry. I think to add to that, so as a rule maker in the Australian energy market, one of the key reforms we're looking at is transmission reform. So, and one of the big problems Australia has is congestion. So how do you get the generation in the right area? Renewables, solar, wind often have to be in areas, obviously, where they can perform the best. So some reforms are related to setting up renewable energy zones, so zones where there are schemes in place that incentivize generation to be located there. The other thing is access reform. So giving, and this is about investment signals. So, people won't invest unless they've got some certainty about the fact that the investment's going to, be able to operate in a way that provides a return. So we're looking at ways to sort of build in priority into those connections. So at investment timeframe, you're looking to have generation in a particular area, you know you're going to be prioritized in the dispatch run. You know that you won't be constrained off. So that helps get plant on the ground in the investment timeframe. But then there's also the dispatch process and how that operates to ensure that people are properly dispatched. So they're complicated things. You've got the tension of people who are already plant that's already in place and how they get grandfathered into the process. But it's certainly something that we're looking at to hopefully navigate the issue of congestion. I think on the other side of things is at the sort of distribution level, there's the demand side. We're looking to open up the market, so it's a two-sided market. You empower people at a residential level. You empower the demand sides that they can participate. It's complicated, as we talked about before. Distribution wasn't built to allow large amount of exports, but networks are looking in Australia. They're looking at ways to innovate to allow that to happen. So moving away from sort of static limits to export into the grid to sort of what's called dynamic operating envelope. So they sort of test at a small connection level, it's sort of 30-minute increments as to how you can get efficient exports into the distribution. And that also incentivizes allows for pricing that can incentivize, even at a residential level, people to participate in the market. That gets more efficiency, greater operation of the distribution level. Hopefully that reduces prices as well. And then, it lessens the burden on large utility scale generation as well. So you can have things like virtual power plants, for instance. So, people who've got solar on their roof can actually, when they're aggregated up, can operate like a power plant. So, I think these are ways of getting the different options of getting participation in the market.
I want to go back to the way you framed the question earlier about siting. And, when I think about siting, the thing that comes into my mind is NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard. And I think that is how I would characterize much of how we first started our work in terms of moving towards this transition, and avoiding the potential for that is part and parcel with how we've moved forward with our procurement process. So we don't simply just go out, buy something, and hope for the best. We put a lot of effort into pre-screening, pre-qualifying, and vetting a potential development before it even breaks ground. Do they have lease on the land? Do they have a route that has initial permitting set up? So a lot of the potential concerns with NIMBYism we try to address before we even sign a contract. And in many ways, that has helped us achieve a completion rate that exceeds the national average for projects under contract. Typically, once we have something under contract, everything is at the point where we have a high confidence they will ultimately be generating power by their on delivery date. So that's one of the many ways we've kind of looked at siting. Now, in New York, despite what many people think of when I say the word New York State is a very heavily intensive farming state, a lot of prime farmland. And one of the growing concerns is farmland also makes really good solar fields. And so there's a growing concern that as we deploy these fields, we're taking away from what has been the core of the state's growth and history. And so we established a farmland protection working group to actually look at these issues and concerns. And we've tailored incentives around incentivizing locations that try to avoid prime farmland. And preliminary reports suggest this has been very favorable and well received by both developers and communities alike. But I see this as something that's going to go on because, this doesn't just touch on, again, the big projects that we see. It's going to require individuals to do things that they haven't historically done before. Sitting before us, Bob Wyman, he's long been an advocate for geothermal systems. And we all know the deeper you go into the earth, the warmer the temperature, the better a geothermal system you can obtain. In New York State, we have a 500-foot rule. If you go deeper than 500 feet, there's a whole slew of additional permitting requirements you have to go through. So no more? We got rid of that? We'll talk later. But oh, perfect. See, I'm not even keeping track of all the things we need to do. But that's one of the many things that's challenged geothermal projects in the state over the years, and understanding the implications of them and how they can affect the financial viability and potentially the energy output of these projects. That's a whole nother ball field. And a lot of the work, as we've all kind of mentioned, it's not going to happen far afield away from site. It's going to be happening in your homes, in your apartments. And so a bigger question is, how do we get all of that work that's going to need to be done in your living space completed? How do we put in an external facade system to add additional insulation in a home that's occupied 364 days out of the year? What kind of disruption would that have on a person's life? How do we upgrade an electrical panel to handle the additional load from EVs and all the other electric appliances that are coming in? That's a whole other part of this that we're also looking into and trying to figure out ways from both a staging, but also a management of that load to make sure that whatever we do is as cost effective as possible, but as minimally invasive in the lives and day-to-day living of everybody it affects. So you can keep that.
Stephanie, I wanted to bring you into the conversation on sort of the international perspective on this issue, just or diplomatic. I know that you've worked quite a bit to work with other countries in a diplomatic capacity, trying to help them understand ways they can increase their ambition. How much does this issue of we can't build enough stuff quickly enough come up, or other competing priorities, or perhaps financing issues? Like what all right runs the gamut,
All the
right?
time, I think, and it depends on which countries you're talking about. There are some. Okay, there are some parts of the world where it's all about finance. There's not enough. I mean, that's a challenge for I think most countries, but some parts of the world where it's really insurmountable at the moment, and we need to find ways to drive more resources there. But in a lot of cases, and particularly countries that have been facing an energy crisis in the recent months, the lack of existing infrastructure is the real challenge. The reason we're sending more gas to Europe and trying to make that happen is because right now they need gas if they're going to keep all of the lights on, and they're going to keep people warm and hospitals running and all of that. And it's an acute need, and we understand that. So the siting is a problem, not just because it, I think, affects current decisions, but also it just takes certain things off the table right now when you're dealing with other crises. And if there's always going to be crises that are competing with the need to make this transition, and the lack of infrastructure that's up and running and ready to go is going to make it increasingly harder for these issues to get the airtime they deserve when countries are making those decisions. Now, I do think, and in the conversations that we engage on with Europe, when I was there, and are still going on, yes, there were conversations about gas, but there were also conversations, I think, to your point, Jim, about behavioral economics and trying to figure out ways that we can use, existing technologies and apps and, things of that nature to help people be more smarter, make the smarter choices. They don't want to be the cause for energy prices to go up. They don't want energy to be the cudgel that Russia, throws into the mix that breaks Europe apart from each other, that breaks the US apart from Europe. And if there are easier ways for them to make the choices that'll provide cleaner power or less power in their day-to-day lives, I think they would make good use of that. So there's a lot to be done, I think, in the way of solutions for really empowering consumers in ways that we haven't fully explored yet.
Just an observation on some of the European response. I think at the start it was very much a quick reaction to the tightness of gas and potential tightness of oil, which never really occurred. In parallel to ensuring that over the short to medium term gas will be provided with sufficient molecules to keep heating, particularly during different seasons, and then also electricity going. Very quickly, the dialogue turns to what we can do to remain as an enduring benefit in our crisis response. So what can we embed in the marketplace to reduce the volatility of the crisis in the wholesale market, flowing through to the retail market? It will endure. And this year's crisis is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But next year's crisis, or crisis 3 years in, might not be that. But we put in place a mechanism. I'm not softening the type of signal we want to to lower carbon emissions. But demand response is now a hugely embedded piece of the European regulatory scheme and will remain for industrial use, for small and medium enterprise use, and particularly around individuals in their homes. And the response in terms of demand, both in terms of overall demand over the winter period and particular peaks, has been significant. And they're the types of socially embedded engineering that will remain. And you can provide bonus incentives and analysis incentives to the market, incentivize investment in technology. I think that there are certain aspects of crisis and crisis response. Some arose from the molecules and electrons part of the crisis. Some arose because of the crisis the world has found itself in. And the will be having slightly more pragmatic response to emergency.
Yeah, is it? Is that mic working for anyone? No. Okay. And do we need to talk into mics for the recording sake? Maybe. We'll try. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you all. I want to turn to something that just seems to keep bubbling up, is the issue of affordability. It's pretty clear that electricity needs to remain affordable if we're going to triple demand, if we're going to shift from 20% of final energy to 50% of final energy coming to electricity. And also if we're going to ideally not just maintain, but enhance affordability for those least able to bear the burden of high energy costs. I know that's a big set of issues. And with the Ukraine crisis, really tightening gas supply and driving up gas prices globally, and other shocks to the system that are inevitable as we transition. How do you all think about affordability? How do you prioritize all of these different competing needs to invest more? You're responsible for allocating costs between customers, setting prices. How do you think about how we maintain an affordable system? What does affordability mean to you in this context? That's it.
I just spoke.
I can go first.
Okay, thank you.
So we do think about affordability quite a bit, and not just keeping costs down, which of course is, we think about as a primary driver, but also equity and justice. And so we've done some work to create metrics for affordability in different geographic zones in California. So start to think about how do the changes that are occurring and how do the increased rates that we're seeing affect different people in different parts of California, and obviously with an eye towards those least able to pay, and at least able to bear the costs. And so and then we have started to kind of embed the types of equity and social justice metrics and concerns across our decision making. And some of it means, if we are creating a transportation electrification, we're telling our utilities to invest in infrastructure. We're making sure those investments are made for medium and heavy duty, which of course impacts air quality and tends to hit our lowest income Californians living in disadvantaged communities the hardest. And then with the rest of it, we have them focusing in those areas that we have mapped out as being the most impacted, the most marginalized in California. So we target investments. We're also looking at rate reform. And we've done a lot of work on demand response. I know everybody is thinking about that. We certainly are too. So not just about conservation and saving money, reducing load growth through conservation, but using demand response and how do we use it in the most effective way. When do we want to see load drop? Our industrial customers certainly have big chunks of demand response that have been helpful in our extreme heat events. We're working with residential customer design programs that, of course, with increased automation, we have smart meters that were rolled out throughout California, which is harder than it sounds, but we have those now. And so we can start working with advanced technologies, laying the groundwork for advanced technology to support rates that we're designing, and with an eye towards an optional rate where you can get benefits for performing better than anticipated at the grid at the time the grid needs it, and potentially you're charged more if you're using energy at times when the grid is most burdened. And so hopefully that will be both a baseline reduction of what's driving our need and build out now is mostly the net peak time. When the sun is going down, we're still relying on gas, but also extreme events. And so we're designing the rates to help support the work we're doing and to avoid new build. But it's not easy. It's complicated, and sometimes you can't. Demand response is not always economically beneficial. Not all times of day. We don't need it at all times of day. But it's something that's actually also really exciting, and I think there is a lot of just untapped potential there, especially with electric vehicles. So as more and more people have electric vehicles, you have a significant amount of load that can shift, not just to push power onto the grid, but also to manage charging and manage demand. We're also looking at an income graduated fixed charge. So in California, only certain rates have a fixed charge. Everything else there's a lot of charges we collect volumetrically. Big portion of the bill is volumetric. And we've been instructed by the legislature to consider moving some of those fixed charges that the utilities collect through volumetric rates into a fixed charge, and making it income graduated. So we're looking at tiers. We've been told to have 3 tiers. So in that way, our lower income customers pay less of the fixed charge. And then with the rest of the bill, we'll still be able to vary that according to these new dynamic rates that we're designing. So it's in the works now, but I think it's also something that is really exciting in terms of resetting rates for the future.
I think from our perspective, so we don't do economic regulation. We just do the rulemaking function. In Australia, we have a separate market body that does economic regulation. So I can't speak to that necessarily, but from a rulemaker's perspective, we look at affordability, I guess, in terms of investment certainty, and also getting the market settings right. So you talked about metering. We also had some reforms put in place a number of years ago, which tried to bring competition into the metering process. So you'd have competitive service providers manage part of that process rather than the distribution business, the monopoly businesses. It's been very, very difficult in Australia as well to get smart meters rolled out everywhere, but we're reviewing that at the moment. But we feel that's key. Having the smart meters at a residential level allows small end consumers to have access to services that then hopefully empower them to make decisions. So from our perspective, it's about consumers having information so they can make informed choices, but also just making sure that the relevant technologies and the market settings are there to allow them access to that information. And then I think on the other end of things, when you're talking about affordability, you have to have regard to how much does it cost to build a whole lot of this stuff. So going back to my earlier point, I think it's about trying to make sure that investment decisions, building plant, building transmissions done in an efficient manner, such that those prices, are efficient prices that are ultimately passed on to end use consumers. Yeah, so I think that they're the 2 perspectives that we think about it.
So I'd echo much of what was just said. We do, however, economically regulate our utilities in New York State, and we do the rulemaking as well. And I think for us, the interesting thing about it is the conversation about what we mean when we say just and reasonable in our mandates. And that's one of our mandates as a commission. We have to make sure that the rates consumers pay for the energy they consume are just and reasonable. And ultimately, what that means is it has to be sufficient to keep the lights on, the gas flowing, the cable working, whatever it may be. That does not necessarily guarantee affordability, right? There have been dozens of studies that talk about affordability, where in America, they highlight a 6% of your income as the threshold for affordability. And we in New York, we adopted that as a goal, a target, something we're striving to achieve several years ago prior to me coming on board to join the commission. And in doing so, what we're trying to move towards through a variety of mechanisms are rates and supports where particularly low and moderate income individuals can cap their energy spend at that 6% threshold. But there's multiple challenges. 6% of what energy? Does gasoline count? What about fuel oil or propane? Natural gas, electricity? So this is actually one of the many interesting things about moving to a primarily electrically driven society. You have one source of fuel that powers everything, your car, your home, your phone, everything. And implementing that 6% affordability target becomes far more reasonable when you have just one vehicle through which to do it. So a lot of our thinking is moving in that direction. But it's not just within the commission. The regulator, the state legislature has also identified affordability as a major issue. And coming on the tail end of the COVID pandemic, we had a significant arrears problem. And we addressed this, again, by working with many of our fellow state agencies provide benefits and incentives to low-income individuals to identify those individuals of greatest need, cross-reference that information with individuals experiencing arrears. We're able to deploy several $100 million to pay off, in many cases, completely arrears accrued throughout the pandemic. And that was a great success. You can read all about it in the papers. But what was interesting, and I find most appealing about it, is that created a set of relationships and connections between state agencies that often would not necessarily work together. And that connection is something that I'm hoping to build off towards whatever else we can do in the future towards achieving that 6% target that the commission has set for energy spend for the population of New York. So we have a plan. We have an idea of how to get there. A lot of it is going to come down to how many of our investments in other areas are going to work out, and then how we can manage that information. You remember I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges is going to be data privacy, right? So you can imagine sharing data from, say, the tax department to a utility and back and forth. How would that work out? We need to work out those kinks if we're going to make this work.
Yeah. Please.
I mean, I think it's also just something that struck me. First of all, of course, affordability is central also to the political winds being at our backs and able to implement new policy. But I think also it's just, these are real challenges, and everyone on the panel over here, we represent some of the largest, most stable economies in the world. And it is a huge challenge to do this in a way that's affordable, and taking a bigger step back and thinking about the climate crisis, you require countries around the world to be doing this, right? And I think it's really remarkable what all of you are doing every day and what you're able to accomplish, because the whole world's going to need to learn from you, and you're sort of first out of the gate facing a lot of these challenges. And yeah, and I'm just, again, amazed. And when I think of the scale of the challenge, I'm grateful there are people like you working on these issues.
I think the world needs to learn from missteps as well, Stephanie. We tend to be really good at providing case studies about how we tried to do something and how we did it really, really well and how brilliantly it worked out. We tend not to be so good at releasing case studies about a mistake we made nationally 20 years ago in a piece of policy that we're paying for today and for the next decade, or a case study around how you can't skip the step of technology we're still stuck with. Well, not yet, but if you go in this direction, you absolutely can. And I think actually, Rory, in terms of data, the legislative key in Ireland now does not facilitate the type of data sharing that will get us there. It just doesn't.
Can you be specific?
Yeah, so it's not just sharing data about, let's say, economic, whether that be geographic or ABC1s, different demographics, and how they respond to different types of energy signals. It's more the detailed data being collected by our smart meters and the uses to which that can be put. So I can get my supplier to advise me on which one of their plans might be best for me, but no other supplier can advise me on what plan might compete with that. Our distribution system operator, who would save millions, if not billions, over the course of years with access to that data on a more granular level, has not gotten that access to that data yet. Whereas if the foresight had been there not to make that in advance, it was made with all good intentions at the time to protect personal data. But it was quite a blanket protection, quite an absolute protection, and some of the subtleties and nuances we're now only understanding. Consumers can consent, but what you would like to have is an opt-out as opposed to an opt-in. And there's loads of studies about defaulting, particularly behavioral. As a civil engineer, it's kind of strange for me to talk about behavioral economics with such love, but I do love it. Defaulting studies, where if someone defaults to a green tariff, there's a couple of great studies done in Germany, like 12 years ago. I forget the regions, I pronounced them wrong anyway. But they were brilliant, and the people who moved into that region defaulted to a green tariff that they paid a premium for, but yet most people stuck at it. And it wasn't necessarily just the inertia to switching, it's because they were part of that region, that green region. A tiny anecdote, when Ireland phased out plastic bags, we introduced a levy for plastic bags, whereas previously it was an incredible littering problem, environmental disaster, single-use plastic bags. And 5 cents was being charged if you wanted to use a plastic bag. And initially the tightness of the Irish shone through where no one wanted to pay it. And it didn't matter, was it 50 cents or 1 cent, it was the fact I had to pay. But the studies post-fact showed that within about 3 months to 6 months, society just decided that they didn't want to be seen walking around with a plastic bag. The thing to do, it was all peer, it was all social, was to have a reusable bag. And you were a pariah walking around with a plastic bag. You felt like making an excuse as you entered a room with one of these things. That power of peer and social is really going to help us with infrastructure, with understanding, with action on climate, across the board. It's so important. I rabbited on longer than I thought it would, but at least it's the microphone this time.
I mean, California, I think has similar issues, right? With people releasing their smart meter data to the utilities to put it to good use, and others as well. I mean, this is a ubiquitous issue, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, everything you said resonated, including the plastic bags, which we recently banned. And I think about the time when people said, nobody's going to separate their garbage from the recycling and put it in 2 bins. That's just not going to happen. And now everyone does it. And so I think there's a lot of changes that are possible that seem impossible when we first encounter them. But absolutely the privacy. There are a lot of people who feel very strongly about privacy. For the income graduated fixed charge, there are possibilities like use existing programs. So if you're on, we have a CalFresh program for food, and so we could tap into those so that we're not having the utilities review tax returns.
Getting access to the income data, right, is challenging for
right.
the utilities. Jim, I actually, you almost led us to what I was going to ask as our next question. And I would love people to be specific about negative case studies that they've either endured, or you could throw your predecessors under the bus. What are you dealing with that you really wish you weren't? But in all seriousness, I'm curious what you feel you wish you had learned the easy way, maybe for other regulators that may not be as far along on the energy transition as you were, or perhaps it's something unrelated to the energy transition as an energy expert or regulator. So curious if anyone has.
One I didn't mention
regrets.
already, we overestimated the level of resistance to smart meter acceptance in terms of the technology in the home. We significantly underestimated the challenge of getting people to take up smart tariffs, to understand that the smart meter gave me the power to use electricity at a cheaper point in time, that action that I could take is an easy one to take, and then that I want to take that action. So awareness first, understanding, and then activation. This is all back to behavioral economics again. So we're only now at the stage where we're developing these case studies where lots of people of lots of different demographics can go online or can hear on the radio, see on TV, someone who has genuinely benefited from the smart meter. And the signal that's being sent isn't just down to tightness on the grid in terms of capacity. Increasingly, it's down to greenness also. And that's going to be very, very important going forward, because when we talk about delivering resilience and security supply, two slightly different things, but very much related, and then decarbonization at an appropriate and affordable price. Demand matching to electricity that has effectively a zero inframarginal rent, or pretty much a zero cost when it's produced. That is the point at which you find best balance. And I think the more lessons we can learn, good and bad, and share rapidly between one another, the better. And again, it's just that piece where sometimes the poor practice shared is worth even more than the good practice shared, if I can put it that way.
So I'm going to harken back to an example from my energy efficiency days. And the rule of thumb is standardize what you can, and if you can't, make it easily customizable. In doing the very early days of CFL replacements, we were concerned at a particular project that the individuals in the homes would take those bulbs and sell them and just simply replace them with incandescents. I know, wild. But that was a concern. And so the bulbs we ended up deploying were these very unique bulbs that had a tip at the end, and they would not work anywhere else. So you couldn't put them in a standard bulb socket. They were just for this specific socket at this specific location. So we deployed thousands of these bulbs, hundreds of thousands of these bulbs, and they worked. You could see the energy drop. Nobody was selling them. But then the next time we needed to change the bulbs, the price doubled. And we're like, whoa, okay, what's going on here? We thought, okay, well, maybe we can try to buy regular CFLs, because at this point, the price of a traditional CFL was cheaper. It's just these were some funky bulbs with the tip, and those would not work in the sockets. So we had trapped ourselves in a situation where we'd have to now go back and do an entirely different energy efficiency program to fix what we thought was a good energy efficiency program. We waited till LEDs got cheap enough, and we just did the whole thing over. But that was one of what I've got a list of stuff like that. And it all comes down to, again, if it's standard, it's good. If it's custom, make it easy to customize. And this was not one of those situations. Just thinking ahead as a regulator, I don't want to throw any of my fellow regulators under a bus. And I like all my predecessors. But there's lots of things one could look at from a regulatory perspective and say, oh, that was a mistake, or we shouldn't have gone in that direction. But the key thing to keep in mind, you can only act based on the information available to you at the time, right? And things change in a blink of an eye. No one knew there would be a major forest fire in Australia in 2019. That would be followed by a global pandemic. That then would be followed by a huge economic turmoil around the world, followed by more forest fires. I mean, we've been living crisis to crisis to crisis. I'm sorry, I love Hamilton. I almost sung it out loud. But we've been going from crisis to crisis nonstop for the past few years. And I don't think people fully realize what that means. When you have a crisis, you have to respond. And what may have worked under normal conditions may not. And we're at a period in time where I think we're engaging in major changes during a period where there are going to be major crises. So the important thing is to be as nimble as you can and not be too set in your ways where you can't change, and not create enough flexibility where it's impossible to do so.
And accept the fact that some of the decisions that we might have taken over 12 months to get them 95% right, we're only getting them 80% right now, and we need to iterate the next 5 years.
So I wanted to comment to say that, Jim, I thought you were going to say the opposite, that we have any little misstep and it becomes the thing that everybody knows about, versus all of the successes and all of the work that we've done don't get talked about as much. And so the example in California, who hasn't heard that California had blackouts? So in 2020, we had a major climate event, extreme heat wave. And our system operator used a tool that is part of the toolbox to avoid the system from going down, rotating load shed. And so for 2 nights, at that period when our solar was dropping, there were some rotating outages. Customer by customer, so total of about an hour and a half on the worst day, about 15 minutes on the second day total. And so nobody's power was out for the whole time. They were rotating through customers. And then for the rest of the heat wave, we managed to use our flex alerts, a voluntary demand shifting. People stepped up. We got assistance from other states. And since then, we've developed a lot of tools to deal with these extreme events. But, we were seeing temperatures on Death Valley. We saw the hottest temperature on the planet in Death Valley, and these heat waves that we have never seen before, and a system that has worked very well. Our renewables have been outstanding in their performance through the events the climate change events that we've experienced in the past few years. Some of our gas plants tripped. But we've been able to keep those online too because we depend on them. But everybody knows that happened, and it has become by some to be a reason that we shouldn't be greening our grid. We have also heard a lot of, why is California setting a target to ban the internal combustion engine when they don't have enough power to power their grid? When in fact, electric vehicles will be a big help in events like this. So it will be an important tool that we'll have. It will grow and will become even more useful as we experience higher and higher temperatures. So it's an interesting spin on your point.
I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think nationally, certainly, we only get a beating for our lack of success. But I do think that even for us in Ireland, we're in a capacity. We have a tightness in capacity now. So we secured contracts for 0.5 gigawatt, which is big for us, of thermal capacity, very, very important when it is needed, and it dropped out, as that left us with a gap. So part of our evolved plan was to expand our rota load shedding to include specific parts of industry, give them a little bit more advance notice, and to look at their backup generation use themselves and reach behind the meter, in fact. And then also part of that was the enhanced communications that California had used in 2020-21 and had learned from. So we looked back at that, and we didn't look and point a finger. We said, what can we take from over there at that point in time, Alice? So again, I think it's just those times of challenge, there's so much learning from them. They're a real opportunity for us.
You referred to before about case studies, and then smart meters popped into my head, but 2 people have already spoken about smart meters. I think everyone's sick of hearing about smart meters. I mean, we're in a unique position in that we actually often have to do reviews of our work. So we will make rules, and then often like 5 years later, we'll be tasked with actually reviewing them. And I think in doing that, we have learned a number of things. One thing is, reform is often difficult when there's a lot of uncertainty about the outcomes, and sometimes you do need to take risks. And sometimes you just need to narrow the scope of the reforms. So, get something implemented quickly that targets directly the issue, and consider sort of broader reforms at a later stage. It's not always the case. You have to sort of take the path of always reforming in a broad context, which can delay change. Sometimes you need to break things down. So I guess that's sort of one learning as well. And the other thing is stakeholder engagement. There's a variety of ways to engage with stakeholders, and it's really important to think of sort of informal ways of engaging with stakeholders. Where we've got a number of statutory requirements around how long we consult for, and the consultation process, but you should sort of think innovatively in terms of how you engage with stakeholders to ensure you get a variety of views on reforms. So, yeah.
Okay, we are starting to reach near the end of the time that we had allotted together. We have about 7 minutes left. So I wanted to pose what will probably be the last question, and ask you all to put on your optimist hats. And my question really is, what makes you optimistic that we can reach net zero emissions by 2050, or whatever goal you either have internalized as a human being or that you face in terms of your mandate from either the legislature or otherwise? And maybe we can start with Stephanie and just kind of walk it back this way.
Look, I mean, I'm optimistic because, as Rory said, we've been going crisis to crisis and ultimately haven't lost sight of the end goal here. And I think that is remarkable. There are lots of reasons to give up on doing this every day. Someone else mentioned that we're the nerds up here. Of course, we believe this is worth doing, important to do. We're going to keep fighting this, but there are plenty of people who are looking for reasons why this is too expensive or too unreliable or too dangerous to continue trying to pursue. And that's not the direction we're going in. And so I'm optimistic. I'm also optimistic because I think we're also learning a lot of lessons, not only in sharing best practices, but also in communicating up and down the levels of government. I think that there's a lot more communication between in Washington. I'm seeing the international and domestic policymakers, and then also between the national policymakers, the state, local authorities as well. And I think that the more we can make sure that what is being discussed at the international level is informed by what's happening in towns and cities across the country, and that's happening in countries around the world, I think the better off we'll all be. But no, I'm a cynic on a lot of different aspects of this, but ultimately I'm quite optimistic.
I'm optimistic as well because I see society has taken notice. Society is changing its behavior. So I don't think it would be easy, but I think that social and peer aspect will take place. I think particularly for those people who convince us that an iPhone 10 is worth $1,000, start convincing us that your response to a signal in energy is worth taking, we'll make that response, right? We buy things, we believe things that are sold to us by professional sellers. And another cynical point that also gives me optimism is that big money has taken notice and has realized that they can only make money from a planet if the planet exists. And I know ESG has softened recently, but it is there. And the amount of money that oil majors are investing in renewables and in hydrogen and in long duration energy storage, including not just the rare earth metal stuff, the common earth metal stuff and older chemicals, it all points in the direction that the money is listening as well. And no matter what the political will, no matter what the social will, it needs money, and it can't all come from the consumer through their
So I actually am very optimistic, despite some of the challenges that I talked about. And California is only 1% of global emissions. And so I suppose that should keep me from being optimistic. But actually, I have had enough experiences like these to hear from people from all over the world. And I know that there's work going on in countries all over the world. And we learn from that. Same as what you mentioned, Jim, is that we are looking around for best practices from other states, other countries, and trying to bring those back to California. And then the other point on political will, I think one thing that is in our favor is that renewables have come down in price so much. And so why would it make sense, even if you want to build a coal plant, to build one right now? And so I think that makes me very happy. It makes me feel optimistic. And then the final thing is in the next generation. I think that younger people now really want this. They're hungry to stop climate change. They know how important it is. They're motivated to learn. They're motivated to learn what that really means, and to take action to help and support. So.
As a lawyer, I tend to be pessimistic about most things. But on this, I am quite optimistic. I think humans have a great capacity to innovate, and I think we're seeing rapid changes in technology, and I think that will continue to happen. So I think the solutions are there, and they're on the horizon in terms of many of the challenges we're talking about. And I agree. I think the economics are there as well. Like a lot of renewables are just, the economics is there to build them. They're far more efficient. And I think that's just going to increase. So purely on economics. It's also optimistic. Yeah.
So I'm going to try to say what's not been said, but the gist of it is we have a long track record of as a species of surviving. And coming away with some miraculous things that most people would think are impossible. If I had told you 20 years ago that California would experience no load growth while increasing its economy, you probably would have laughed at me. And if you were an economist, you would have laughed really hard because that's unheard of. Energy growth, economic growth, GDP growth, hand in hand. Every economic textbook says this. We've been breaking that trend between California and New York and every other state that's been investing in renewable energy and energy efficiency. We can do that. We put a man on the moon in less than 10 years. St. Crispin's Day. You know what I'm talking about. So we can do these things, and I see the economics lining up. The technology is already there to do some pretty amazing things. The things that are blocking us in many ways are the rules, the laws, and human behavior. So I see we're at a point where we have opportunities like we've never had before to really make green energy and the people that use it line up in a way where we can truly decarbonize our economy. And I'm an optimistic guy, I'm not a lawyer. So I have every reason to believe that this is going to work. 20 years ago, when I first started working in the energy space, I never saw this kind of interest. I never saw this kind of attention. We're at a completely different place today, and it's only going to increase over time. So I have every reason to be optimistic.
Well, what makes me optimistic in this moment is the incredible leadership that you all are showing, and the fact that you all are in a position to implement the energy transition and are already, or have today, just displayed incredible sort of command of where we're going and leadership to come. So please, everyone, join me in thanking the panelists. I think you guys will be up here if anyone wants to discuss briefly, but thank you all. Thank you all for being here.